Today let's go over heat transfer basics. This is how heat transfers from one area to another or one object to another. Make sure you have your notes paper out and you're ready to go. The first way we're going to talk about heat transferring is conduction. This is when heat or thermal energy or heat energy moves between objects that are touching or are in direct contact with each other. So that means I have to be holding something. I have to be touching something. A spoon has to be touching a hot liquid. The iron has to be touching fabric. There has to be direct contact for it to be called conduction. Some examples are I could touch a hot pan on the stove. A cold spoon could get put into a hot liquid, and slowly that spoon would heat up through the direct contact. You've got heat from a hot sand onto your feet, so your feet are in direct contact with the sand. If you lay down on a heating pad, the heat goes directly from the heating pad to your body via direct contact. An iron making clothing hot when you iron it. And my favorite is that cheese melting on a hot hamburger. The heat from the hamburger transfers to the cheese and makes it yummy and melty and ooey and gooey. The next type of heat transfer we're going to talk about is convection. We talked about this way back in the beginning of the year when we talked about convection currents in the mantle, when hot magma rose to the surface and cooled off and then it sunk because it changes in density. Well, that's the same as convection here. It's when thermal energy or heat moves through liquids and gases in currents. So it's moving up, it's moving down. Another way I like to think about it is it's circulating. So think of the density. Hot is rising, cool is falling, and it's circulating the whole time. So again, the Earth's mantle is a great example, and we talked about that. Water boiling in a pot. The water that's closest to your unit or your gas or your stove is going to heat up the fastest. It's going to get really hot and it's going to rise. When it gets toward the top, it's going to cool off a little bit. It's not going to get cold, but it's going to cool down a little bit more than the water on the bottom, so it's going to fall. And that's going to create the circulation that we know as boiling water. Hot air in a balloon. When we release some hot air into the balloon, it goes up. As that air cools off, the balloon goes down. Our land and sea breezes are a great example of convection. As the warm air heats up above the land, it goes up and out over the sea, where it cools and it falls and it starts back toward the land. That creates our sea breeze. We're going to talk about more of those when we get to local winds. Deep ocean currents are another great example. Deep in the ocean, the water near the equator heats up. It begins to move toward the poles. As it gets closer and closer to the poles, both the North and the South Pole, it gets cooler and cooler until it gets so heavy and dense that it sinks, and it begins its journey back down to the equator. And finally, warm air in a two-story foyer or in a two-story building. The heat on the bottom is going to slowly rise to the top. So your upper areas are going to be a little bit warmer than the colder areas. So sometimes your bedrooms that are upstairs are much easier to keep warm than maybe your den or your kitchen downstairs. The last type of heat transfer we're going to talk about is thermal energy or thermal heat that moves by electromagnetic waves through space or through the air. So a good example is heat from a fire. When you're standing close to the fire, your hands warm up. It's not because you're touching the fire, but it's because the heat is radiating off the fire and making its way through the air till it gets to you and your hands. Okay, sunlight heating our skin. We're not touching the sun. the sun's radiation is coming through the atmosphere and it's warming up our skin. A car getting hot in the sun, cooking in a microwave, wax melting on a flame from the candle. So the radiation is coming off of that flame, and the wax close to there is receiving that radiation and it's beginning to melt. Roasting a marshmallow is another really good example. Unless you like it burned and you stick it all the way in the fire, you're going to count on the radiation coming from the fire to warm up that marshmallow and get it toasty and wonderful. So those are the three types of heat energy transfer. Again, we have conduction, which is direct contact. Convection is the circulating in gas and liquids due to convection density. And then radiation, moving through space or air by electromagnetic waves.